So good afternoon. Welcome to the Hearts of Freedom Project. Thank you very much for being agreeable to participate in this project, to share your experiences about working with Southeast Asian refugees. It's very much appreciated. So I'll begin by asking you your name, please.
It's Howard Adelman.
Thank you. And I'll begin by asking you, do you recall any memories about what the media was talking about 40 years ago at the time of the wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos? Do you have any memories of?
Very acute memories.
Okay.
How far do you want to go back in the war?
As far as you want.
Well, in the mid-60s, we were part of the students organizing against the war and protesting against the war.
Okay.
We followed it quite closely. My Lai massacre, of course, stands out, but there were other things.
Right.
The escalation of the air war under Johnson, his not running again.
Yeah.
The whole fight over the election and the fight in the Chicago. I mean, the '68 was a crisis all over the world.
Right.
But my involvement of following the war goes back to '64, I believe,
Okay.
when we started protesting against the war. I think we called it imperialist war, but that was a bad term. No, generally Canadians were not supportive of the war effort. And then it became increasingly less supportive. And we began, by the end of the '60s, we were receiving draft dodgers and then deserters from the thing, from the war. And my research showed that probably our biggest refugee movement in the history of Canada was Americans fleeing the Vietnam War.
Yes.
It's not counted because they didn't come as refugees.
Right.
They just came as immigrants.
Right.
But it was a very big movement if you include not only those people, but their parents who got their kids out, who took jobs in Canada so the kids wouldn't be drafted, etc.
Right.
And then I was in '68 in Sweden when the first deserters came, who deserted in Vietnam, not in Germany, and came through Korea to Russia, and then came across to Sweden and interviewed them. So I interviewed the first 12 deserters from there. So I got a sense, different perspectives.
Right. Good. Thanks for that. So where I'd like to begin is, you're aware of I'm sure you were aware at the time of the Southeast Asian refugee crisis.
No.
Oh, you were not aware?
Not at all.
How did you become aware?
I was writing a book on Hegel at my island, and there's no communications. That's why I go there.
Okay.
And I was also writing a big review article on the books that came out in the previous year, on the treatment of the Jewish refugees in the '30s. There's a British book, an American book, Canadian book, none is too many. The book wasn't out, but I was reviewing their paper. They had published a paper. And there was a couple others. So I was delivering this review article back in Toronto. It was a deadline in June. And I also had to run a workshop for the Quakers in their island retreat in the Thousand Islands. So I left the island, and for 6 weeks there'd been this front page news coverage, blasting coverage. Now, I can't say I didn't have any information, because when the Hai Hong incident happened, there was lots of information, and I read it, but read it very casually, not in any intense way. And when we agreed to take a quarter of the people on board, and I knew that they were reputed to be the wealthy who bought themselves out with gold bricks, but that was the media coverage, as it turned out. but that's all I knew. When I left the island and learned about all this coverage and was delivering the article, so that was in my mind, what had happened to the Jews and how they were treated. And I said, this can't happen again, this is crazy. So when I returned from Ireland, I had a couple days in the house before I went back, and I organized a meeting in my house of the local ministers. 2 rabbis came, a priest from up the corner who I knew, the alderman came, and a few friends. So it was a group of about 20 came to my house. It was arranged for after church on Sunday. So it was arranged for 1 o'clock, and everybody who I invited came, which is unusual in itself, which says something about the built-in frustration. And we heard a knock on the door 5 minutes after we started the meeting, and I went to the door, and the head of settlement from Ontario and the head of public relations were at the door and asked, they heard about the meeting, could they attend? I mean, I had to get over my shock of 2 civil servants coming to a private house on Sunday at 1 o'clock.
So they were representatives from the federal government?
Yeah.
Okay.
They worked for the federal government. I mean, as we put it back together, the alderman had alerted Ron Adke, and Ron Adke said, send some guys over to the house. That's the shorthand. But at this time, I didn't know anything about how they got there or how they heard about us. Anyway, he said, come in, no problem. And we were there to debate writing a letter to Adke to say, take more refugees. That's essentially what we're going to do. As we're 20 people composing a letter, you know what composing a letter from 2 people, never mind 20. So we were 15 minutes into this letter, what should be in it, and et cetera. And they interrupted and said, do you mind if we make a suggestion? And we said, no, not at all. And I was chairing the meeting, and essentially the director of settlement said, do you know about the clause in the act that provides for private sponsorship? Never heard of it. So he explained what the clause, it's only 1 sentence, and we said, oh, that's really interesting. Would you guys think of doing private sponsorship? Well, we thought that's far better than writing a letter. He said, it's like witnessing, and within 3 minutes we abandoned the letter and said, well, let's private sponsor some refugees. So we organized to sponsor 50 refugees from 50 sponsorships from our riding. The synagogue would do this, and the synagogue would do so many, and the priest would do something, and we'd contact others to do something from Ron Adke's constituency. And since we were in his constituency, he was a minister of immigration, that's why we're writing the letter, you see. Right. So we said, yeah, it's a better idea to do witnessing. Now, the side story of this is that one of my graduate students wanted to catch me while I was in Toronto and asked me if he could meet with me on his thesis. And I said, well, I haven't got much time, I'm in Toronto, but look, come to this meeting and we'll do your thesis right afterwards. And you might find the meeting interesting. So he came to the meeting and then we worked on his thesis, but I had no idea, never told me he was a stringer for the Globe and Mail. The next thing I knew was I got a call at 6:30 in the morning from Marystown, Newfoundland, and the woman said, what can I do to help Operation Lifeline? And my answer was, what's for Operation Lifeline? Never heard of it. And she said, but it's got your name and number here. Where? And she said, in Dick Beddoes' column. Dick Beddoes. I don't even read Dick Beddoes. Anyway, read me his column. So he had a full-page column in the Globe, in which he wrote a fictional story about this guy who abandoned his thesis up north, got the philosopher wrong, and came to Toronto to save the refugees. Totally untrue story, but that's what he wrote. And if you want to get a hold of him, he's founded Operation Lifeline, and there's his phone number. So Dick Beddoes named Operation Lifeline. And it was the old style of journalism where factual truths don't matter much so much as the excitement of the story. Anyway, the result was she called and I said, "Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, you're the chairperson of the Marystown chapter of Operation Lifestyle." And she protested, "I'm just a housewife. I don't know how to do it." "Here's what you do," I said. "Get your local minister, organize a meeting in a house, you organize the chapter. We'll send you information in the next 72 hours to tell you how to do everything." I have no idea, of course, how to sponsor, how to do anything myself. I hung up the phone, and we wrote down her name and address, and the phone rang again. The phone never stopped ringing for 2 weeks. Literally from 6 in the morning till midnight. Just went steadily. By the end of that day, we had, I think, about 40 people working in the house as volunteers. Showed up at the house. Yeah. People tried to reach me on the phone, couldn't reach me. So I'll give you an example. At about 9:30, went to the door, but the bell door was ringing all the time. So the doorbell was a little chaotic. And opened the door, and there's 3 guys, literally, with piles of money in their hand. And they were Ugandan Asians, had come with the refugee intake from Uganda. And they said, "We want to donate some money to you to help refugees." And I said, we're not in the donation business, we don't take it. He said, "Why don't you guys sponsor refugees, and I'll tell you, so we'll tell you how to do it, et cetera, et cetera." I had no clue yet how to do it. I said, "Give me your addresses, form a group of 5, here's what you do basically, and I'll send you all the information." That afternoon, a guy who I'd been a lawyer, I had been in graduate school with him, phoned me and said, he phoned. He got me on the phone. And he said, "Howard," and we chatted, "I haven't seen you in a few years." And he said, "Well, the core of it is, I've been trying to reach you all day, that I tried to get our church to sponsor since February and was unsuccessful. And I've collected all this material that may be helpful to you." He was a member of the United Church. So I said, "Come on over." So we'll look it over. We spent all night, and we prepared a booklet of 66 pages on how to sponsor, what to do, what the law said, essentially. So we had something to give to I think we had about 16 chapters by the end of the day. By the end of, I think, 10 days, we had 66 chapters across Canada. All by this phone call. And it turned out that, in retrospect, only 1 chapter in the whole thing went wrong. And there we had to do a correction. It was the one in Mississauga, where the person who phoned was a little bit nuts. And so she wanted to take all the people to an island in the Pacific and all this little madness. But that got corrected. That took a little doing. But essentially, I never got back to the island for 2 years and got immersed in this Indo-Chinese refugee movement.
Can I ask you what year that was?
79. It was June of 79. At that time, the government had agreed to take 5,000 refugees, and then when the Tories got elected, they increased it to 8,000 with 4,000 private sponsors. Then Ron phoned me. Ron was also a colleague at York University, so he had this.
Ron Atke.
Yeah. So he phones me and says, because we were overwhelmed with people who want to sponsor, he said, how many can you sponsor? I said, well, in I think it was 2 weeks, we had our 50 sponsors from our constituency, and I said, it's going to go, I guess we'll go to 200 maybe, who knows, I don't know. But assuming just a very modest figure, and take about a quarter of the constituencies get involved across Canada, multiply it out, if you take 2 for every one we take, we can take probably 20, 25,000 at the rate we're going, and maybe more. So he took that, and I suggested a 2-for-1 formula, and it turned out that there became a 1-for-1 formula. That's because Flora MacDonald's father told her that no, 1-to-1 sounds better. That's what Flora told me, how the idea came 1-to-1. Essentially, they said, we'll do the 12,000 to 4,000, but anything above that will match on a 1-for-1 basis. So they were already committed, and so it meant we had to get 22,000, they had to get 28,000. That's the way it worked out. In any case, we achieved that total within 3 months.
Okay. Can you talk about some of the partners that came to the table to support Operation Lifeline?
We didn't have any partners.
Oh, but did you not say that there were, the Jewish community was involved?
Oh, all kinds, but they weren't partners.
Oh, okay.
Operation Lifeline was, all kinds of people came to, I mean, you can't imagine, they came out of the woodwork from all over. I mean, the Dentist Association passed a motion, the Lawyers Association, all kinds of people were passing motions, offering help and all this kind of thing. So we had free medical help for the refugees. We had whatever we wanted. Dentists will give free dental services.
Okay.
So they weren't partners, but they were just coming out of woodwork. Okay, you'll do this, fine, great.
Right.
And got it, like Jay Keystone was, he just passed away last week. He was an expert in tropical medicine. He organized any problems with health, which might be related to, he organized a group of doctors that would examine them to make sure they were okay. So it didn't matter which area we're talking about, people, but it wasn't an organized, nobody formalized in a partnership, etc. I mean, we ended up having a board of directors. I was never on the board or anything. We got a board together because the founder of Shoppers Drug Mart, I used to deliver drugs for, was a delivery boy at his drugstore when he had one drugstore in College Street. And I don't know if you know Murray Koffler. Anyway, he's passed away now too, but he was a famous philanthropist. And he volunteered to help, so I got him on the board. We got some other people on the board and formed a board. But he was the one who got us into fundraising. We never did any fundraising, and I argued against it. I said, we'll just do education. He said, you'll need funds. So I said, I'm not going to get into fundraising. He says, I'll take care of it. So he raised $500,000. He got the CBC to run a big, a show, a 2-hour show, raising money.
Okay.
And that raised about $300,000 alone. And CBC had never done that before. Okay. So we ended up having a fund, which was a good idea, and I was wrong, because some of the sponsors got in trouble financially for different reasons, or some had very difficult cases. So there was a fund to help them out. They could apply to the fund to get extra money. And it was used. It was a really good thing he did. But that wasn't my doing. But that was the way it worked. I mean, different people did different things, and,
Okay, so carry on.
Anyway, so various people were doing various different things. The one who ended up running it was called Wendy Shalou. She showed up at the house as a volunteer, worked day and night as a volunteer for about 2 weeks. And then it became obviously we needed a full-time person. So the provincial government, I think, gave us some money. And the City Hall phoned up, John Sewell's the mayor then, phoned up and said, look, I'll give you space in City Hall, because the house was teeming with people. I mean, it was great. It wasn't workable. One phone line, no cell phones then.
Right.
So it was crazy. So they gave us facilities, and then the federal no, it was the Ontario government gave us a floor of a building, an old building they had. And it was a big floor, so we moved in there, and all the volunteers would come. And Wendy Shalou, who was trained as a hospital administrator and was preparing to go with her husband to Baltimore because he was a doctor and got a job there. Anyway, she ended up being the administrator for 2 years, and it took over lots of people's lives. That's what happened.
I'm sure.
And depending on the chapter, it depended how well they worked out. The longest lasting chapter was in Hamilton. A couple who ran it all kept going through just well past Indo-Chinese, well into the century. Most wound up after the Indo-Chinese, but you got things like what can I think of? Just some of the stories. It'll come to me. I'll talk about unemployment, for instance, because that's a funny story. What happened in the very first week, my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, volunteered to do the employment. She had a fashion business, and so she had to keep getting interrupted as she was showing her imported goods to buyers. Anyway, she got a call that somebody wanted a bagel baker. And she said, I don't think we're going to get bagel bakers from Vietnam. He said, just any kind of baker, send me a baker and I'll help them get settled. Turned out on the flight on that Friday, he had phoned Friday morning. On that flight coming in the Friday, went through the list of people getting off the plane, there was a baker. On Monday morning, he was working as a bagel baker. That's the way things were working. I mean, it's totally nutty. David Frum, I don't know if you know David Frum. He had the Atlantic Monthly, wrote Bush's speeches, conservative guy. His mother was Barbara Frum. Yeah. And I knew the family very well, and he, in his synagogue, one synagogue, organized 60 sponsorships. What we didn't know at the time, in the very early time, was that the Mennonites and the Christian Reform had been on this job since March. I only learned that later when I started doing research on it. They were off the mark and very dedicated, doing really good work. The other person you should know about is Joseph Wong. Joseph Wong started independently of us a sponsorship organization because the initial refugees were ethnic Chinese from Vietnam. He was a doctor in Toronto, from Hong Kong originally, and he organized an organization, and then we invited him to join with us, and he became chair, as it turned out. Not the first year, second year, just joined the board. He was a dynamo. I mean, he was phenomenal. There were all kinds of people like that. We'd come in and we'd figure what suits you, and whatever you want to do. It was that kind of organization. Right. There was no structure to it at all. Okay. I mean, I never had a position ever on the board or as a manager. Or, right. What was my role? I have no idea what my role was.
But you were certainly one of the first initiators.
Yeah, I initiated it with that group. But most things happen by happenstance. But I'll give you another interesting story. It's very important because it was the media made this story. You asked in your list of questions, how did you get people to sponsor refugees? We never ever tried to get sponsors. They're just flooding in. It was managing them and informing them and keeping them educated and getting the word out. That's what it was. So it's a lot of media. So within, Moses Neimer phoned me, I think about the third day. and said, look, I'll give you 3 minutes every night on city TV. You do whatever you want, say whatever you want, talk about it, etc. That's great. So I was on TV 3 minutes every day, telling what the latest news, etc. You had total media support. It wasn't, Star, Globe, it doesn't matter. Everybody was on side.
Yeah.
Not true, though.
Oh.
We didn't know that, but we thought everybody was on side. Later, when I was doing research for my book, I learned that the majority of Canadians, when they moved it up to 50,000, were opposed. Even when it was at 12,000, there wasn't the majority support. There was the opposition. I think we had 46% support then in the surveys done. There was also the problem of handling the racists. The National Citizens Coalition was publishing twice, published full-page ads in the newspapers. First time it published an ad, it said, every refugee is going to bring 16 others, and they're going to flood Canada with, i.e., Orientals. That was the implied thing. Because if you bring 50,000, you multiply it by 16, the country's going to be really changed. So that's their first ad. And then they published an ad, said they did a survey of Canada, and said the majority of Canadians were clearly opposed to this. It was a terrible survey. Questions were leading and all kinds of things. When I found the government surveys later in my research, which was properly done, the figures weren't that much different. They were lower, but not much different. So they were right, but we didn't know it at the time. We were just arguing that it was a terrible survey and all this. So you had a sense there was an opposition out there, whether it was racist or whether it was competition from employment. 79 was the beginning of a recession. Could have been a number of things. Yeah. So you had to run against that, but it wasn't against, we didn't know about the opposite. We're running against these people for making it unwelcome to the refugees because they had spread a racist message, etc. It was Joseph Wong's idea. He got a hold of me and he said, we've got to do something about this. And so we had a brainstorming meeting. He says, I know a guy. And so he arranged a breakfast meeting at the Prince Hotel at 7 in the morning. We go to 7 in the morning, and this is a multi-millionaire, a very wealthy guy. And we told him our dilemma. He paid for our breakfast. 8 o'clock, he said, I'll take care of it for you. Okay. And at noon, he gave Joseph a call and said, it's all done. They won't publish a single ad again. What he had done is phoned 17 of his friends who were all supporters of the National Citizens Coalition. It was, after a right, conservative right wing, and said, if you publish anything like this again, we'll withdraw our support. We'll contact everyone we know across Canada to withdraw their support. That isn't your job. Yours is a job about conservative economic policy, not about immigration. No more. And they didn't say a thing at all. But it loosened up some people like Brown, who was a journalist in British Columbia, a racist guy. And he would come on TV and you'd debate him, and Ron debated him. It was just racist junk. So that was the part of the backlash. But the backlash got controlled because it was very important they not have an organized base. So even though there were a majority opposed, there was no organization opposed. None at all. And every institution, businesses, you name it, the Better Business Bureau, you couldn't find a standard established organization who wasn't supportive. And the churches that originally turned down, the Catholics and the United Church, sponsorship by the summer they got involved and committed. Not all of them. I did go to one United Church in Leaside, and they were having a general meeting on whether to have sponsorship. They had a member pushing sponsorship, and clearly the minister was strongly supportive of it. And there were about 120 members of the church there in this meeting on the subject. And it passed just barely. Just barely. This is with the minister's support, and this is after all the publicity and everything. So there was clearly a backlash, out there that you found out about, but it wasn't obvious at first.
Okay. So as the project was rolling along, were you getting constant and support from the federal and the provincial governments?
We got support from all levels of government. There was and it didn't matter which party.
Okay.
It was just every establishment, every party. You couldn't imagine a better scenario for organizing, where you're not organizing. Say, do something. On that, it's interesting. I'll tell you another story. I told the story, as I told you, of how Operation Lifeline started. And I'd tell that story to journalists, etc., and whoever interviewed me. And I ended up keeping track. I had 167 interviews that I did with media. After the 12th time, I keep track that I told the same story. No one in 167 interviews reported how it started. That it was a government idea, not our idea. We didn't have to pressure the government. The government were eagerly looking for people to help. Their storyline constantly was how we rallied troops and pressured the government to take in all its refugees. Total baloney. Total baloney. It wasn't true. The government was as eager to do anything, and it didn't matter when the Tories were in. They were really eager. And when the Liberals took over in February, same thing. No problems.
Okay. Interesting. So, did Operation Lifeline work with other organizations or communities across Canada that also had an interest in helping out refugees? Were you sharing information?
No, we were sharing with our chapters.
Okay.
And chapters could have been sharing with local organizations, and certainly if you were in Winnipeg, you couldn't help but work with the Mennonites.
Yes.
Or if you were in London, Ontario, work with the Christian Reformed Church. So local chapters would make, friends, and there were crossovers. So, for instance, JIAS, the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, phoned and they said, if you have sponsors who are Jewish communities, they can use our institution to sponsor through, because there were the two forms. There were 5 sponsors in one level, but it was far simpler if you had an institutional sponsor, like a church or something, who had signed an umbrella agreement. So they offered to do that, and so we would refer them to them, and we never kept track of whether we did it or they did it. It didn't ever matter to us or anybody. Nobody cared. There was no credits, looking for credits or keeping count of that.
Right. Did you ever have opportunities to work directly with refugees yourself?
Yeah, we sponsored 3 girls.
Oh, okay.
They lived in our coach house behind the house.
Okay.
They didn't speak any English. They were young girls. I could tell you another funny story about that. I took them shopping to Simpsons. You remember Simpsons?
Yeah. When it used to exist.
Anyway, took them shopping to Simpsons. And we're on the floor. And the thing, you get all kinds of clothes donated, but you need to buy them underwear and things like that. Yeah. So we're at the underwear and brassieres and all that stuff. And I'm standing there saying, well, pick whatever you need and want, we'll pay for it. So nothing's happening, and I don't know what's going on. So finally the sales clerk says, look, you go for a walk for half an hour and come back. They will not order brassieres while you're standing here. So I went for a walk, came back, paid the bill. They got settled, but unlike some of the sponsors, we never kept in touch with them, which is disappointing. Partly them, partly me being too busy. So I don't know how they fared in the end.
I'm assuming they would have enrolled in English as a second language classes?
No, one of the things that was characteristic at that time is government-sponsored refugees went into English as a second language.
Okay.
Privately sponsored refugees tended to get into work very quickly and took English as a second language afterwards.
Oh,
So it meant that they were behind the 8 ball compared to government sponsorship refugees. But when we did our research 10 years later, the privately sponsorship refugees were ahead of the government sponsorship. And the answer was simple. They had a whole network to get them jobs, to do this, to help them along, so and networks are critical in economic advancement. So that was one of the big benefits, but the language training was a lack of benefit. Because unlike now, where you have to put all the money up at front if you're sponsoring a Syrian refugee, all you had to do was pledge your commitment. And that's why when some groups fell apart, they got in fights or something like that, and there was no way to pay the thing. That's where the fund that Operation Lifeline raised was used for the groups. There weren't that many, but there were some. There were other kinds of things. We're at Kipling, right? We're stationed. I remember because it was out here. There was a family, a religious Christian family, had sponsored 2 girls. And they phoned us up and said they had a crisis. What's the crisis? Well, they couldn't tell us over the phone. So, it seemed really serious, so I said, okay, well, come on. Turned out the older girl who'd been in prostitution in Vietnam was engaged in prostitution in Toronto and was teaching her sister, her 13-year-old sister, prostitution. And this was the crisis. And that was a tough one. That was not easy. We got some social workers involved. I never saw what eventually happened, but we put a group together to counsel the family how to deal with it. But it took a lot of energy and a lot of professional help for that, kind of event. So there were events like that where you could call on people, and people gladly gave their time freely without any problem. And you had nobody, I don't remember anybody ever refusing if I asked. All glad to do it,
Right. So you talked about the unstructured nature of Operation Lifeline, but if sponsors or refugees themselves needed specific types of help like dental services or healthcare or anything like that, I'm assuming they could call Operation Lifeline and there'd be somebody there to be able to direct them to the proper service.
Exactly. That's what the office was, that the Ontario government initially was at City Hall, but it was in August already, they moved, they had a whole floor. And the floor, it was, I guess, 10,000 square feet floor.
Okay.
It wasn't small, and I had volunteers working all over the place. I'd walk in there, I didn't know any, I knew the core people, but there were so many people I didn't know at all.
Okay. And the infrastructure was there. They had the telephones that
the government gave us the desks, the phones, the space.
Right.
They didn't pay anybody. But then we got a grant from the federal government to do that. And that came not for asking. The federal government said, you're going to need some money. And that's when we hired Wendy. And it was true. That we didn't have any argument about. We didn't, because it's chaos, unless you have an administrator. And so the board hired her, and the government gave a grant to Operation Lifeline to run. It was a small grant, I think 56,000 or something. It wasn't much money. Later, they gave money for an employment center, etc. But now, of course, you have immigration services much more developed than they were then. Though Toronto had Welcome House, so, but a lot of centers didn't have an equivalent to Welcome House.
Right. Okay. Do you know of any types of relationships that would have grown out of the relationships between sponsors and refugees over time?
Sure.
Did you hear stories of?
Oh, lots. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Could you share some?
Yeah. A lot of them, I don't know what percentage, but a number of refugees who were sponsored effectively became members of a family or two families within the group. In almost all the groups, one or two families were in the lead. And in some families, they adopted them effectively.
Okay.
So they would have them over for dinner, etc. They'd help them when their kids wanted to go to college or whatever it is they did, and it became a continuing long-term relationship. I don't know what percentage. I never did any work, but there were quite a few. And you'd hear stories about who did it. We didn't do it in our case, but there were definitely people who did. Oh, Elaine Slater was one. She became chair of Operation Lifeline, and her group, she'd have them. She owned a farm. She'd have them at the farm. She'd have them birthday parties, take them. You know, they never lost their contact.
They continued their connections.
Yeah, they continued the connections. Yeah, and when I subsequently have interviewed refugees, I remember a dentist out in Calgary telling me a similar story of how he came and how he had to get retrained, and he went to McGill and he got all this help from his group to go to school, etc. And they're his friends. They're part of his friends group, close friends.
Right. You wrote several books. Can you talk about? You would have written books about the Southeast Asian crisis?
Yeah. I wrote several books. One, it was mainly about how this sponsorship group grew up and how other refugees were dealt with. So part of it was historical. One, for example, going back to the Hungarian refugees, then
Yes.
the Czech refugees. It happened to be that when the Hungarian refugees came, I was involved in that from two angles. One was a farce because a theater director at the university organized us. There were about 24. We were going to volunteer to fight against the Russians in Hungary. You know, re-echo the craziness of the Spanish Civil War. Anyway, but the war was over before you could do anything. I mean, Russian might. But then we took 37,000 refugees into Canada, and that was, of course, the United States took 38,000. Usually they take 10 times as many as we do. We were stepping up to the plate in big ways. And that was Jack Pickersgill's doing. I don't know if you know the story of Jack Pickersgill.
It's back in history.
Well, it's a phenomenal story of what he did. Anyway, but my role was I was running the student cooperative housing at the University of Toronto, and so we housed 42 Hungarian refugees in the summer of '57, I guess it was. So, you know, you go through each stage and different people appear out of the woodwork.
And you continue to write articles, as I understand.
Yeah, well, what happened was Irv Abella, who co-authored None is Too Many, which is the book about the taking in, refusal to take in Jewish refugees in the 30s, you know. That was when the Deputy Minister Blair said, how many refugees can you take? And he said, none is too many. Canada had the worst record of taking Jewish refugees. So when Irv saw that I had collected all this stuff on the Indo-Chinese refugees, he said, you know how much research I had to do to collect stuff from the third? You got to save this stuff. So he organized for the humanities, social science, and the research council to give us a grant to preserve and sort out the thing. And he took over a space. The university gave a space outside my office in the hall, and we put a wooden barrier around it, and that was our little library. It was about this big.
And this is the University of Toronto?
York University.
Oh, York University.
York University did it where I was teaching. Anyway, so that was the start of the Refugee Research Project, which developed into the Center for Refugee Studies, which is the second biggest research center in the world on refugees. Bigger ones in Oxford. And so it was in that context that we did research on, for instance, the homeless in Lebanon when Israel invaded Lebanon, the Sri Lankan refugees. Each time we did it, it had just direct effects. The Sri Lankan is a good example, because we went to Sri Lanka because the government was turning down refugees who were saying, well, we're being persecuted in the Jaffna Peninsula, etc., and there's a war going on. And Canada had no information on it. It was rejecting these people. So we interviewed a lot of them, 6. We did 6 interviews, and we said, these guys there's, veracity in what they're saying, but there's no evidence. Nobody's got any research or scholarship. So we went over there and met the Canadian ambassador. We had cooperation from the Toronto Star, who put up the money for the flight, and, the government was going to help us to the extent they could. The ambassador said, look, no Westerners allowed up in the north. Nobody knows what goes on. There's lots of rumors, but nobody has any data. They said, well, we'll go up. And so we got on a train, and we got kicked off the train. So we bribed a taxi driver, give him $100 American money. Can he get us know the way up to get north? Okay. And he said, yeah, I'll get you there. And he didn't get us there really, but he got us up to just before the Jaffna Peninsula passage. He said, get on the train here. They don't check people after this point because no Westerners come over here. Get on the train and you'll get in because everybody will think you're okay then. And we did, and we were okay, except we were driving along into the peninsula and they blew the tracks up in front of us. So we had to get transferred to buses and all this kind of stuff. But I ended up spending 2 weeks before I got arrested by the army. And we collected all this data on what was going on, and we came back, and there was, Toronto Star published 2 Saturday and Sunday, 2 full pages on Saturday, 2 full pages on Sunday of what I wrote up. And within 2 weeks, the government changed its policy and started taking people from Jaffna. So it's been a very, kind of open system where you take, even when there was the incident over the reneging on the matching formula, the so-called reneging. That went awry and shouldn't have. I'll give you the story backwards, because when we gave Flora MacDonald an honorary degree at York, I was her host. That's proposed her for the honorary degree. And she said, as we were, I always thought you were my enemy. I said, why would I be enemy? She said, you led the criticism of when I froze the 50,000. Yes. And I said, I never led it, first thing. Secondly, my understanding is it was all accidental, and I had done work to find out what happened. And so she was relieved but she had a total misunderstanding of me. But generally, the NGOs were really critical and falsely critical of her. Because what had happened really is they had a budget. The private sponsorships were getting so overwhelming, etc. And she handled it by just saying, well, we can't do any more. In fact, the government minister, she had, actual story is she was in a riding in Kingston, went off up to Ottawa, had a TV interview, shows up at the TV interview, they're asking these questions. She was late, and they didn't have time to brief her. She goes in the interview, and that's when she announced that we're freezing. She didn't get feedback from her deputy minister, who had an answer. And the answer was very simple. Just say, we'll continue the private sponsorship, and we'll hold off public sponsorships till the next year, so private sponsors won't get frustrated. That was the answer they'd come in, but she instead gave the freezing policy. So it's just one of these miscommunications. She's had such a warm heart for refugees, it was totally unfair. And then, of course, it became a little bit of a football. When there was a meeting, I was abroad in Israel in January, February of '80. As a visiting professor at Hebrew University. And get a call, can I come back? It's urgent. So I fly back, it's a meeting, and this is in January, and they said, we want to make it, all the NGOs involved and all the support, had this general meeting, to get involved in making it part of the federal campaign, the election campaign.
I'm sorry, what year was this?
This is already in 1980.
1980,
And
okay.
the dilemma by then, I knew that of how much, if you make it part of the campaign, you're going to be a loser because there is this majority who don't want the refugees. So you have this dilemma. And I said, so you're going to get these coming out of the quicksand. And secondly, there's a misunderstanding. I mean, it doesn't matter which party's in power, they'll support taking a refugee. They have different ways of doing it. They'll make an Axworthy will say 60,000, doesn't really matter how they put it. Everyone will take the same number, they'll increase the number in one way or another, depending on that. So you don't have any enemies on any party. So why do you want to make it part of a campaign? And I talked them out of it, and I thought that flight was really worth it because they were going to make it an election issue, and that would have been very bad for the refugee movement, in my opinion. And it turned out not to be, of course. It wasn't necessary to make it a public issue.
Right. Finally, to this day, are you called upon to make presentations about your experiences working with Southeast Asian refugees?
Not so much, very little.
Okay.
I got called in when the Syrian refugee movement, we worked on that. We tried to get, it was Mike Malloy and myself and Naomi, and we prepared, it was really Naomi's idea, to get a whole formula for how to take Syrian refugees to make it easy for the government, essentially taking them in as guest workers.
This was Naomi Adelman.
Yeah, Adelman.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, she's terrific. Mike and her, the civil service at the time, who were in all levels, were phenomenal. Just really talented and committed people. Anyway, we got the three of us, and we came up with a proposal, and we got it tested in Halifax and out in Calgary. And we were surprised how easy it was to bring the businesses who used guest workers behind. They said, how much it costs us to train a guest worker, and then we lose them in 4 years. It's stupid. So this is far better for us, and we'll put money behind it, and we agree with it, etc. But we couldn't get the government at the time was a conservative government, but not a pro-refugee government, to accept it. In fact, when we met with civil service, they said that delete the word Syrian, because he doesn't want Syrians, the PM. And then it will, they said, we'll figure out a way to get it right away. because if we try to get us a new policy, it'll take us 18 months. And I said, but it takes 3 months to get it, not now. And then they said they'll use it under, they came up with a way to get it under an existing one. They said, we'll be able to do that maybe in 6 months. In fact, it never got done. The government at the time, nothing was approved if it didn't go through the Prime Minister's office on every detail, and they were frozen. You know, the immigration department had been really depleted, so that when the Liberal government got elected, they inherited a department that was much, much weaker. And so you had to hire all these people to deal with the Syrian refugees. Many, many more had to deal with them than we ever had with the Indo-Chinese refugees. And of course, when the Indo-Chinese, those guys worked in the field, they worked, what, 800-hour weeks. I mean, it was brutal. And that, you know, had all gone, that whole ethos. And there was still some good people around the department, but basically it had been decimated. And it had no policy center because they'd closed its library, they closed the think tank that came up with the ideas. So the idea of 79 of civil servants coming to my house, of civil service going around and trying to initiate these things, they had the approval of the minister, of course, but they took lots of initiatives, you know, and were creative in the whole operation. Of course, you couldn't be when you don't have a government that doesn't endorse the creativity in its civil service.
Right. Do you have any final thoughts about your experience working with Southeast Asian refugees?
Well, it's like, you know, there's nothing I've got credit in my life more than this, both personal and public recognition. You know, in the Order of Canada, it doesn't matter what, you get lots of recognition, and that goes on. I mean, I probably get invited every year to the Vietnamese Association meetings. The last one was in February. We were in Mexico. And, oh, we want to give you an award for this and this. So I said, I have to send my family. I'm not coming back from Mexico. Enough. Anyway, my family went, 10 members of the family, and they had a great time. And you know, and my nephew took the honor on my behalf. So it was an education for them. It was good for them. So there's this continuing personal kind of thing. And there's, of course, the great gratitude is phenomenal citizens. Just, you couldn't get, you know, it's terrific. I once, maybe it was the 15th anniversary where I was called in to give out scholarships. And, you know, I'm always willing to help whatever I can. So they're giving out scholarships. They're giving out 15 scholarships. I'm handing them out. They're announcing the averages of each of the students. There were 14 girls and 1 guy. No one had an average less than 96.4%. You know, and this thing, who benefited? We benefited. And it didn't cost us hardly anything, and we got all these great citizens. That was, you know, terrific.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.